I hope everyone had a nice break, and welcome back to the end of the world. 4 days ago, most of you were probably on vacation. Some of you were at the beach, some of you were sleeping in, and then you woke up on Saturday morning, checked your phone, and the world had changed. So let me be blunt with you. We are now living through the kind of event that historians write entire volumes about. The United States and Israel have launched a full-scale military campaign against Iran, and as we sit here today, it is day 4. Nobody knows if this will last weeks. Nobody knows if this will last years. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that the world you grew up in, the one with cheap flights to Dubai, the one with stable oil prices, the one where great power conflict felt like something from your grandparents' generation, that world is over. And what I want to do with you, starting today and continuing over the coming weeks, is not just describe what's happening. I want to give you the tools to understand why it's happening, to predict what comes next, and to test those predictions against reality as events unfold. Because everything we talk about, you will be able to verify. It's all happening in real time. So let's start with what happened on Saturday. In the early hours of the morning, Tehran time, a coordinated American and Israeli air assault targeted the personal compound of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. Now, in military language, this is what's called a decapitation strike. The idea is simple and ancient. You kill the king and the kingdom collapses. The coalition forces claimed that they had precise intelligence on Khamenei's location, that the strike was surgical, and that the mission was a success. They also claimed that a human intelligence asset on the ground was able to confirm the kill. Initially, Iranian state media denied everything. They said the supreme leader was alive. They said the reports were propaganda. But within about 36 hours, the story changed. State television broadcast a statement acknowledging that the Ayatollah had indeed perished in the bombing. But here's the thing, they didn't frame it as a defeat. They framed it as a choice. They said he was 86 years old. They said he had been battling prostate cancer. They said he had been offered safe passage to Moscow, that the Russians had extended this lifeline, and that he refused it. He chose to remain in Tehran. He chose to die on Iranian soil, and he didn't die alone. According to Iranian reports, multiple members of his family were killed alongside him. His daughter, his son-in-law, grandchildren. The message being broadcast to the Iranian public and to the wider Muslim world was unmistakable. This was not a military failure. This was a sacrifice. This was martyrdom. And if you want to understand everything that follows in this war, you need to understand what that word means to the people fighting it. Iran is a Shia Muslim nation. Now, most people in the West don't fully appreciate the distinction between Sunni and Shia Islam, but it is one of the most consequential divides in human civilization. About 90% of the world's Muslims are Sunni. The Shia have always been the minority, and as minorities often are throughout history, they have been persecuted, marginalized, and pushed to the edges of power. And that experience of suffering has shaped their entire theology. At the very core of Shia belief is the concept of martyrdom. The foundational story of Shia Islam is the Battle of Karbala in 680 AD, where Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, chose to fight and die rather than submit to a ruler he considered illegitimate. He was outnumbered. He knew he would lose, and he fought anyway. That story is not a footnote in Shia Islam. It is the story. It is reenacted every single year during the holy month of Muharram. Millions of people weep in the streets. They beat their chests. They mourn as if it happened yesterday. And the lesson they draw from it is this: when the forces of injustice come for you, you do not submit. You stand. You sacrifice. You die if you must. And in dying, you inspire others to continue the fight. So when the Iranian government tells its people that Khamenei chose to stay, that he chose death over exile, they are plugging directly into the deepest emotional and spiritual current in Shia culture. They are saying, this is Karbala again. And when you understand that, you understand why the American and Israeli calculation that killing the leader would demoralize the enemy may turn out to be catastrophically wrong. Because for a people whose entire identity is built on the glory of sacrifice, you haven't weakened them. You've given them the most powerful motivation imaginable. You've given them a martyr. Now, there's another event from that first morning that I need to talk about, and it's one that's going to be debated for a long time. On the same morning that the decapitation strike hit Tehran, a school in the southern part of the city was destroyed, killing approximately 150 children. These were girls, primary school age. The images that came out were devastating, and they spread across the Middle East within hours. Now, what actually happened is contested. The Israeli and American position is twofold. First, they say the school was located adjacent to a military installation that was a legitimate target. Second, they say it wasn't their munitions that hit the school, but rather an Iranian air defense missile that malfunctioned and went off course. The Iranian position is straightforward. They say the Israelis deliberately targeted the school. And when you hear that, your instinct might be to say, that's absurd. Why would anyone deliberately target a school full of children? But then you have to reckon with recent history. You have to reckon with what happened in Gaza over the preceding years, where thousands of children were killed in Israeli military operations, where schools and hospitals were struck repeatedly, where the Israeli government's own statements suggested a tolerance for civilian casualties that shocked much of the international community. I'm not telling you what to believe about this particular incident. What I'm telling you is that in the court of public opinion, across the Middle East, across the global South, the Israeli denial carries very little credibility. And what this event has done, whether it was intentional or accidental, is pour gasoline on an already raging fire. It has hardened Iranian resolve. It has unified a population that, before this war, was deeply divided, with massive protests against the government just a few years ago. Those divisions have evaporated overnight. When your children are being killed, you stop arguing about domestic politics. So that's the emotional and psychological landscape of day one. Now let me shift to something different. Let me shift to money, because this war is not just about religion and revenge. It's about the architecture of the global economy. And to understand that, we need to talk about a place that might seem surprising. We need to talk about Dubai. For the last 2 decades, Dubai has been one of the great success stories of globalization. It positioned itself as the Singapore of the Middle East, a gleaming, ultra-modern city rising out of the desert with the world's busiest international airport, world-class airlines, no income tax, beautiful hotels, and a cosmopolitan atmosphere that attracted wealthy expatriates from every continent. The pitch was simple and effective. Come here, make money, live well, and don't worry about the instability in the rest of the region because we're neutral. We're the Switzerland of the Gulf. We don't take sides in anyone's war. And it worked. Tens of thousands of Europeans, Americans, and wealthy Asians moved their families and their money to Dubai. Real estate boomed, finance boomed, tourism boomed, and all of this happened under an implicit security guarantee from the United States. Dubai didn't need to spend much on its own military because the American Fifth Fleet was parked just down the coast in Bahrain, and American bases were scattered across the region. The deal was America provides security, the Gulf states sell oil in US dollars, and everyone gets rich. And then, on day 2 of this war, Iran attacked the Gulf states. Missiles hit infrastructure in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait. And the reaction from these countries was almost comically naive. What are you doing? We're neutral. We're not part of this fight. And the Iranian response, delivered not in diplomatic cables, but in the trajectory of ballistic missiles, was essentially this: there is no such thing as neutral. You house American military bases. You allow American and Israeli aircraft to use your airspace to bomb our cities. Your neutrality is a fiction, and we're done pretending otherwise. Offering $250,000 US, offering $250,000 US for a seat on any plane going anywhere. Think about that for a moment. Think about what that says about the fragility of the entire Dubai model. It was built on a single premise: safety. And in a single morning, that premise was destroyed. Now, will Dubai recover from this specific attack? Maybe, probably in the short term. But the long-term damage is existential because Dubai's value proposition was that it was a safe place to put your money, a safe place to raise your family, a safe place to build a business, and now the entire world has seen that it can be hit by Iranian missiles with very little warning. If you're a hedge fund manager deciding where to set up your next office, if you're a tech entrepreneur choosing where to relocate, if you're a wealthy retiree looking for a tax haven, are you choosing Dubai, or are you choosing Singapore or Tokyo or Montevideo or Lisbon? The calculus has fundamentally changed, and that is not an accident. That is exactly what Iran intended. Now let me tell you why this matters beyond Dubai itself. Let me tell you about the most important 33 kilometers on Earth. If you look at a map of the Persian Gulf, you'll see that it narrows dramatically at its southern end into a channel that separates Iran from the Arabian Peninsula. This is the Strait of Hormuz. It's about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. People have swum across it. It's absurdly small. And through this tiny bottleneck flows roughly 20% of the world's oil supply every single day. 20%. Let me put that in concrete terms. India gets about 60% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. China, about 40%. Japan, roughly 75%. South Korea is similarly dependent. The Japanese Prime Minister has stated publicly that if the strait closes, Japan runs out of oil reserves in approximately 8 to 9 months, after which the Japanese economy ceases to function, not declines, ceases to function. And as of today, the Iranians have effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. This is the economic equivalent of a nuclear weapon. And to understand why, you need to understand something called the petrodollar system. Here's how it works. The US dollar, like any fiat currency, has no inherent value. It's paper. It's numbers on a screen. Its value comes entirely from demand, from the fact that people around the world want US dollars and need US dollars. And the single biggest driver of global dollar demand for the past 50 years has been oil. The Gulf states, led by Saudi Arabia, agreed decades ago to sell their oil exclusively in US dollars. This means that every country in the world that needs to buy oil, and that's every country in the world, first needs to acquire US dollars. That creates massive constant demand for the dollar, which keeps it strong, which allows the United States to borrow cheaply, to run enormous deficits, to fund its military, and to maintain its position as the world's dominant economic power. This is the foundation of American empire. Not aircraft carriers, not nuclear warheads, the petrodollar. Now think about what happens when you close the Strait of Hormuz. The Gulf states can't ship their oil. No oil shipments mean no oil revenue. No oil revenue means no dollars flowing into the Gulf. And here's the part that most people don't think about. For years, the Gulf states haven't just been earning US dollars. They've been investing those dollars, hundreds of billions of them, into American financial markets. They own enormous stakes in US stocks, bonds, and real estate. Look at the investment charts from 2012 to today. The money flowing from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait into Wall Street has been growing exponentially. And a huge portion of that money has gone into the technology giants, the 7 or 8 companies that make up a disproportionate share of the American stock market's value. You know the names: NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon. These companies are not just tech companies anymore. They are pillars of the American financial system. If the Gulf states are suddenly unable to generate revenue, they won't be investing in American markets anymore. In fact, they'll be pulling money out to fund their own defense and domestic needs. And if that happens, the American stock market doesn't just decline, it enters a crisis. And because the American economy has become so financialized, so dependent on the wealth generated by stock market valuations, a collapse in equities would trigger a broader economic depression. This is what Iran understands. You don't have to sink an aircraft carrier to defeat the American empire. You just have to close a 33-kilometer waterway. But the economic weapon cuts even deeper than investment flows. Let me tell you about the thing that people in the Gulf never want to talk about: water and food. The Gulf states exist in one of the most inhospitable environments on the planet. The Arabian Peninsula is, for all practical purposes, a desert. It has essentially no fresh water. It has essentially no arable land. The only reason cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and Riyadh can sustain populations in the millions is because they import nearly everything they consume. 80% of the food consumed in the Gulf states comes from overseas. 80%. And the fresh water that people drink, that fills their swimming pools, that irrigates their decorative gardens, comes almost entirely from desalination plants, industrial facilities that take salt water from the Gulf and convert it into fresh water through energy-intensive processes. About 60% of the Gulf's water supply comes from these plants. Now let me connect the dots for you. How hard is it to destroy a desalination plant with a drone? Not hard at all. These are large, fixed industrial facilities sitting right on the coastline. They might as well have targets painted on them. How hard is it to destroy an oil field with a drone? Also not hard. Oil infrastructure is massive, spread out, and virtually impossible to defend against low-cost aerial attack. And the drones that Iran is using, the Shahed series, cost between $35,000 and $50,000 each. Iran manufactures about 500 of them per day. Estimates suggest they have stockpiles of roughly 80,000. They can fit a dozen on a single truck. They can be launched from anywhere in Iran's vast mountain terrain. And each one of these tiny, cheap, disposable weapons can knock out a desalination plant, an oil field, a power station, or an airport. And what does America use to defend against these drones? Systems like THAAD, Thermal High Altitude Area Defense, and Patriot missile batteries. These are impressive-looking machines. They're the kind of thing that makes you feel safe when you see them on television. There's just one problem. Each interceptor missile costs about $1 million. And the hit rate isn't perfect, which means you might need 2 or 3 interceptors per drone. So you're spending $2 to $3 million to shoot down a $50,000 drone. And if you're facing swarms of hundreds of drones at a time, you run out of interceptors long before the enemy runs out of drones. This is the mathematical reality of the war. It's an equation that cannot be solved with expensive technology. And this brings us to a concept that I want you to carry with you throughout this entire analysis. The concept is asymmetry. In military theory, asymmetric warfare occurs when two sides of vastly different strength choose to fight fundamentally different kinds of wars. The stronger side, in this case the United States, fights with expensive, high-technology weapons designed during the Cold War to deter a peer competitor like the Soviet Union. The weaker side, Iran, fights with cheap, abundant, dispersible weapons designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of the stronger side's expensive infrastructure. This is not a new phenomenon. You've seen it in Vietnam, where the most powerful military on earth was defeated by guerrillas in tunnels. You've seen it in Afghanistan, where 20 years of American occupation ended in withdrawal with the Taliban still in power. And you've seen it very recently in Ukraine, where cheap commercial drones have destroyed tanks worth millions of dollars. The pattern is clear, and yet the American military establishment seems incapable of adapting to it. Why? Because of something called military doctrine. Doctrine is the set of assumptions, strategies, organizational structures, and procurement priorities that define how a military fights. An American military doctrine was forged in the Cold War, an era defined by nuclear deterrence and the concept of mutually assured destruction. The point of American military hardware during the Cold War was not primarily to fight wars. It was to prevent them by being so terrifyingly powerful that no rational adversary would dare attack. The weapons were designed to impress, to intimidate, to project an image of invincibility. And that worked against a rational state adversary that also possessed nuclear weapons and had no desire for mutual annihilation. But it doesn't work against a religiously motivated adversary that views martyrdom as the highest calling. It doesn't work against drones that cost less than a used car. And it doesn't work when the fundamental premises of the Cold War no longer apply. There's also another dimension to this that is uncomfortable but essential to acknowledge: corruption. The American defense procurement system is, by any honest assessment, deeply corrupt. The incentives are perverse. Defense contractors make money by building expensive systems. Politicians receive campaign contributions from defense contractors. Generals retire and join the boards of defense companies. And none of these people are primarily motivated by the question of whether these weapons actually work in combat. They're motivated by the question of whether the money keeps flowing. A cheap, effective drone defense system would be bad for business. A billion-dollar missile defense platform that requires constant maintenance and replacement is extremely good for business. So the American military finds itself in an absurd position, armed to the teeth with weapons designed for a war that will never be fought, while being acutely vulnerable in the war that is actually happening. Let me bring us back to the map, because geography is going to tell us more about how this war unfolds than any number of press conferences or intelligence briefings. Look at Iran on a satellite image. What do you see? Mountains. The entire country is essentially a fortress. The Zagros mountain range runs along its western border. The Alborz range runs along the north. The central plateau is arid and elevated. This terrain is perfect for hiding military assets. Missile launchers, drone factories, command centers, ammunition depots, all of it can be dispersed into mountain valleys, caves, and hardened bunkers that are extremely difficult to locate and even harder to destroy from the air. This is why Iran has survived 45 years of economic sanctions and international isolation. Geography gave them a natural defensive advantage that no amount of money can buy. Now look at the other side. Look at the Gulf states. What do you see? Flat, open, desert. Every piece of critical infrastructure, every oil facility, every desalination plant, every airport, every military base is sitting out in the open like a target on a shooting range. There is nowhere to hide. There is nothing to protect it. The asymmetry isn't just technological, it's geographical. Iran fights from behind mountains. The Gulf states fight on a billiard table, but Iran is not invulnerable. And this is crucial. Iran's greatest weakness is the same as the Gulf's greatest weakness, just in a different form. Water. Iran has been experiencing a severe and worsening drought for years, driven by climate change, mismanagement of water resources, and a growing population. Remember Lake Urmia? It was once the 6th largest saltwater lake in the world, an enormous body of water in northwestern Iran. In the 1980s, satellite images show it as a massive deep blue expanse. By the 2000s, it had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. Today, you can walk across what used to be the lake bed. That's not a metaphor. That is literally what has happened. And Lake Urmia is just the most visible example of a nationwide water crisis that threatens the viability of Iranian civilization itself. And the American and Israeli strategists know this. Their long-term plan, the one that will never be announced publicly because it would sound monstrous, is to target Iran's water infrastructure, dams, reservoirs, water treatment facilities, power plants that run desalination systems. The idea is to turn Iran's mountain fortress into a mountain prison, a place where tens of millions of people are trapped with dwindling access to the one resource that no human being can survive without. The goal is to create conditions so unbearable that one of two things happens. Either the Iranian population rises up against its own government, or a humanitarian catastrophe forces a mass refugee exodus that destabilizes the country from within. It's a strategy of civilizational destruction, and it is already underway. You're already seeing attacks on civilian infrastructure, on hospitals, on power grids. In the weeks to come, you will see attacks on dams and water systems. Mark my words. There's a grotesque irony in the targeting strategy as well. The American and Israeli air campaign is concentrated on Tehran and other major Iranian cities. And who lives in those cities? The educated, cosmopolitan, progressive Iranians, the ones who protested against the regime, the ones who posted videos of women removing their hijabs, the ones who, in a different timeline, might have been America's greatest allies in transforming Iran from within. Those are the people being bombed. Meanwhile, the people who will fight this war to the death, the Shia militias, the Revolutionary Guard's most fanatical units, the religious hardliners, they're dispersed across the rural areas, the small towns, the mountains. They're exactly the people that airstrikes are worst at reaching. So the bombing campaign is, in effect, destroying the moderates and leaving the extremists untouched. It's a strategic inversion that would be darkly funny if it weren't resulting in the deaths of thousands of people. The Iranians, for their part, have announced total war, and that phrase has a specific meaning. It means that command and control has been decentralized. There is no single leader whose death can end the fight. Every province, every military district, every militia commander has standing orders and the authority to act independently. You can bomb Tehran into rubble, and the missile launches from the mountains continue. You can kill every general, and the drones keep flying. This is a military structure designed to be headless by design, because the Iranians studied what happened to Iraq, what happened to Libya, what happened every time the Americans successfully decapitated a centralized command structure. They learned the lesson. They built a system that doesn't need a head. Now, let me widen the lens, because this conflict is not going to stay contained in the Persian Gulf. It can't. The stakes are too high, and too many other players have too much to lose. Let's start with Bahrain. Bahrain is a tiny island kingdom sitting right next to Saudi Arabia, and it hosts the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet, America's primary naval presence in the Middle East. It has already been hit hard by Iranian missile strikes, but Bahrain has another feature that makes it potentially the most explosive flashpoint in this entire war. Its population is majority Shia, but it's ruled by a Sunni monarchy. The Shia population has been politically marginalized for decades. There were massive protests during the Arab Spring in 2011, and they were crushed with the help of Saudi Arabian troops. But the grievances never went away. They just went underground. And now the supreme leader of Iran, the spiritual authority to whom many of Bahrain's Shia feel religious loyalty, has been killed. In Shia theology, this demands a response. It demands jihad. The Iranian strategy here is brilliant and terrifying. By attacking Bahrain, they're not just hitting an American military base. They're trying to ignite an internal revolution to get the Shia majority to rise up against the Sunni government and expel the Americans from within. If Bahrain falls, it's not just a symbolic victory, it's the loss of America's most important naval facility in the region. And then there's the broader Shia mobilization. Iran sits at the center of what's sometimes called the Shia Crescent, a belt of Shia majority or Shia significant population stretching from Lebanon through Syria, Iraq, Bahrain, and into Pakistan and Afghanistan. In the days since the war began, Shia populations across this crescent have already begun to mobilize. There have been attacks on the American embassy in Iraq. Shia militants in Pakistan stormed the American diplomatic compound in Islamabad. Hezbollah in Lebanon has escalated its operations against Israel. The Houthis in Yemen have intensified their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. This isn't a localized war, it's a regional conflagration with the potential to go global. And that brings us to the really terrifying questions, the ones that will keep defense planners up at night for the next several months. Question 1, ground troops. Everyone who has studied military history knows that air power alone does not win wars. You can bomb a country for years and still not achieve your political objectives. Vietnam proved it. Afghanistan proved it. The only way to actually defeat Iran militarily, to physically control its territory and dismantle its government, is with a ground invasion. And invading Iran would make Iraq look like a weekend exercise. Iran is 3 times the size of Iraq. Its terrain is infinitely more defensible. Its population is larger and far more unified. Its military, including the Revolutionary Guard Corps, is battle-hardened and motivated by genuine religious fervor. American military planners have estimated that a ground invasion of Iran would require at minimum 500,000 troops, and more realistic estimates go well above 1 million. The casualties would be staggering. The political cost would be unimaginable. And the occupation that followed would make the Iraqi insurgency look like a minor inconvenience. And yet, without ground troops, the air campaign cannot achieve its objectives. So the question is, will America commit to a ground war? And if it does, what does that mean for the American military, for the American economy, and for American society? Question 2, nuclear weapons. Iran has been enriching uranium for years. Western intelligence agencies have debated endlessly about how close Iran is to a functioning nuclear device. But here's the thing that matters in a wartime context. If the Iranian regime faces an existential threat, if it becomes clear that the Americans intend not just to degrade their military, but to destroy their civilization, the calculus around nuclear weapons changes dramatically. A rational peacetime government might be deterred by the threat of retaliation. A government facing its own annihilation might decide that a nuclear response is the only card left to play. And even if Iran doesn't have a deliverable nuclear warhead today, the mere possibility that it might is enough to paralyze decision-making in Washington. This is the shadow that hangs over every military escalation from this point forward. Question 3. Who else gets pulled in? Europe is already making noises about involvement. Britain, France, and Germany have significant economic interests in the Gulf and are already suffering from the energy disruption. Europe cut itself off from Russian energy in the wake of the Ukraine war, which means it became even more dependent on Gulf oil and gas. If that supply is now disrupted, European economies face a potential catastrophe. So the pressure to intervene militarily to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz to protect Gulf infrastructure is enormous. But if European powers enter the war on the American side, the conflict takes on an entirely new dimension. Russia has signaled repeatedly that it views Iran as a strategic partner. If Iran falls, Russia's southern flank is exposed. The same geopolitical forces that drove the Ukraine conflict would push Russia towards supporting Iran, possibly with weapons, possibly with intelligence, possibly with direct military involvement. And China, which depends on Gulf oil for a huge portion of its energy needs, faces its own impossible choices. China has tried to position itself as neutral, and its political system is designed for strategic patience rather than emotional reaction. But a prolonged disruption of Gulf oil threatens Chinese economic stability in ways that no government can ignore. So what we're looking at when we pull back to the widest possible view is a conflict that has the potential to draw in every major power on Earth. America and Israel on one side, Iran on the other, Europe likely tilting toward the American side out of economic necessity, Russia likely supporting Iran out of strategic self-interest, China trying to stay neutral but being pulled in by the gravitational force of energy dependence. This is why I used the phrase at the beginning of this talk. This is not a regional war. This is a global crisis, and the decisions that are made in the next few weeks will determine the shape of the world for decades to come. Let me come back to Iran's grand strategy, because it's more ambitious than most people realize. Iran's immediate goal is to destroy the GCC, to bankrupt the Gulf states, to close the Strait of Hormuz, and to drain the economic lifeblood of the American empire. But the long-term vision goes much further. Look at a map of the Muslim world. 2 billion people stretching from Morocco to Indonesia. The vast majority of these countries are ruled by authoritarian governments that are deeply unpopular with their own populations. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Jordan, these are all essentially client states of the American empire. Their rulers stay in power because of American military and economic support. And their populations know it. They resent it. They've resented it for decades. Iran's strategic vision is to harness that resentment. The first step is to unite the Shia world under the banner of jihad, using the martyrdom of Khamenei as the catalyst. But the second, far more ambitious step is to reach beyond the Shia and appeal to the broader Muslim world. To say to 2 billion people, look at what the Americans and Israelis are doing. Look at the children they've killed. Look at the civilization they're trying to destroy. And look at your own governments, which enable all of it. The goal is to trigger a wave of popular uprisings across the Muslim world, to overthrow the American-backed dictatorships, and to establish what you might call a Pax Islamica, a new order in which the Muslim world is united, independent, and free from Western domination. Is this realistic? Perhaps not in its fullest form. But even a partial realization of this vision, even a few successful revolutions, would fundamentally reshape the global balance of power. The American counter-strategy is equally radical, though it's one that will never be publicly acknowledged. We talked about the water crisis. We talked about the bombing of infrastructure. But there's another dimension. Iran is not ethnically homogeneous. At its center are the Persians, who make up about 60% of the population. But the borders are populated by Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Baluchis, Turkmen, and other minority groups, many of whom have stronger cultural and linguistic ties to the neighboring countries than they do to Tehran. The American and Israeli plan, and again, this is something that will be denied at every press conference, is to exploit these ethnic divisions, to fund separatist movements, to arm minority groups, to encourage fragmentation. The vision is an Iran broken into a collection of small, weak, ethnically defined states, perpetually competing with each other over dwindling water resources, too fragmented to ever again pose a strategic threat. It is, if you think about it clearly, a plan for the deliberate destruction of a civilization that is 3,000 years old. And it is the logical extension of a geopolitical framework that views the world as a chessboard and human populations as pieces to be moved or removed. So here we are. Day 4. The missiles are still flying. The oil has stopped flowing. The global economy is beginning to shudder, and we are watching in real time the unraveling of the international order that has existed since the end of the Cold War. What I want to do with you in the weeks ahead is go deeper. I want to use the formal tools of game theory, the mathematics of strategic interaction, to model what each side will do and why. I want to show you how incentives, information, credibility, and commitment shape the decisions of nations at war. And I want us to make predictions, specific, testable predictions about what happens next, and then check those predictions against reality as events unfold. Because the thing about studying the world in a moment like this is that you don't have to wait for the textbook to be written. The textbook is being written right now, in real time, in blood and fire and money. And if we're paying attention, if we're thinking clearly, if we're using the right tools, we can read it as it's being written.